Boris Johnson's letter and his proposals. You are saying it's a more serious effort to negotiate. And can we take it then that up to Halloween, this House will be kept informed at every turn, in those negotiations? I mainly wanted to ask you about your old portfolio. As you know, yesterday the Raise the Roof Homes for All coalition stood outside Dáil, Éireann, and this time last year we passed a motion on their programme. The House passed a motion which called for affordable rent, security of tenure, ending eviction into homelessness, doubling national housing investment, the creation of a legal constitutional right to housing and the declaration of a housing emergency. Now, Fine Gael was the only party to vote against that motion and to refuse to do anything about it in the past year. And while we have had an expansion of housing output at a snail's pace, we still have, as you know, the homelessness and the deficit in housing supply. It's now embedded into our culture and society. In fact, for most of this year, as you know, almost 10,000 people have disgracefully been homeless. And in my own constituency, I meet week in, week out, like I think many other deputies do, families in great distress living in emergency accommodation, in overcrowded conditions in old family homes, sofa surfing between relatives and friends, and even Taoiseach living in cars and vans. In my own constituency in Housing Area B of Dublin City Council, we have over 5,000 households waiting to be rehoused, with nearly another 3,000 on transfer lists, while in the Howth Malahide area of Fine Gael there is another 2,000 more. And yet the monthly housing supply reports from the city and county provide just a trickle of accommodation for those families in desperate straits. And I know, Taoiseach, the same is true of many other constituencies. In fact, the vast bulk of Dublin City Council's housing output this year, 70%, like last year, will be into HAP tenancies. And we know that very few HAP tenancies go on into social housing. Now, your colleague, Deputy Murphy, he told Simon there just recently that his responsibility is to secure a budget that will see more homes being built and more housing output for the rest of 2019 and 2020. But you yourself have said the whole housing Rebuilding Ireland needs an injection of adrenaline to get housing supply moving. Just like Deputy Boyd Barrett, of course, I wasn't surprised to learn either from the Sunday Business Post and from Killian Woods that two-thirds of the fast-track housing approved by Bord Pleanála hasn't been built. In my own constituency, there is a major proposal to build 2,000 housing units, but 1,200 of those are built for rent, and only less than 200 will be actually social homes. And my experience over almost 30 years in watching the planning process, making submissions, is that developers' stories of planning delays, they're totally fiction. They had hundreds of planning permissions granted over the last number of decades. And by the way, they built 250,000 homes in just 3 years in the early noughties. The planning process worked well enough. We didn't need this, but you do need to take action urgently, and particularly next Tuesday.
Thank you, Taoiseach.
Thanks, Deputy. Of course, we'll keep the House informed on the Brexit issues. Next week will be a really, really important week, not just because we have a budget in this House, which is being put together on the basis of a pessimistic outlook, understandably, because we need to be cautious. But I hope that we will see progress next week in terms of the British proposal developing into something that is fit for purpose. And of course, we'll keep the House up to date on developments. Just on housing, in many ways I share your frustration. It is not acceptable to me and to this government that we have more than 10,000 people who are homeless, living in emergency accommodation. We increased by 25% funding for homelessness again in last year's budget. It's now, I think, €146 million a year, predominantly spent through local authorities to make sure that we can provide people with the emergency supports that they need. But that isn't the solution for housing. The solution for housing is to increase supply right across the country, but in particular in places where there's most pressure. And that was the reason why, when I was Housing Minister, we looked at how we can get adrenaline into the house building system, which was a system fundamentally broken across multiple areas. And we looked at planning, we looked at infrastructure, we looked at finance, we looked at capacity, we looked at location. and it was in the context of planning decisions. And I looked at how long it was taking on average to get planning permission through for building a housing estate of over 100 houses. And from memory, the figure was about 75 weeks. And so we put in place a new system, which I would argue is just as robust in terms of testing the quality of planning applications and making the right decisions, as planners are making the decisions in Broughan. They consult with local authorities as part of that process. They have refused quite a few planning applications through that system because they demand high standards, but they do make decisions quicker. And if you look at the numbers of planning, we have seen a dramatic increase in the number of planning permissions that have been granted and the numbers that have been applied for. And we've also seen a dramatic increase in terms of commencement notices. In fact, in the year up to June of this year, 24,226 commencement notices in terms of new houses were being built. That's a 30% increase on 12 months earlier. So please, let's start dealing with the facts here. We introduced a change to the planning system, recognising that we had a housing crisis. And we had to start getting homes built. You can't get homes built unless you get planning permissions that allow that to happen. Changing the planning system doesn't solve everything. And yes, the 16,000 planning permissions that have been given through that new fast-track system have resulted in 6,000 homes so far in terms of construction. But 2/3 of those decisions are in the last 6 months. The first decision through this new system only happened in January 2018.
Thank you, the time is up.
There's always a time lag between planning permission being granted and a developer getting the finance together to be able to start building houses. So let's start talking about the real world here. You can't instantly deliver houses. You've got to get planning permission first. We have a new and better system to do that, and we need to deal with the other issues too, which are part of the Rebuilding Ireland strategy.
Deputy Broughan.
Minister, the facts are simple. When you met those developers about this strategic housing development, did they tell you that they had hundreds and hundreds of extant planning permissions that they just weren't building because they were hoarding the land, wanting to flip it and make the best conceivable profit from it? I mean, wasn't that the reality? And we know in the past that the planning system, it used to be 8 weeks, by the way, at county council level, and then 4 weeks on Broughan. We know that it used to work. We built 250,000, 400,000 houses. We built more houses than the UK built in an earlier time. And obviously that could be done again, but you are not doing it. And that's the reality. Unfortunately, Fine Gael has shown that you can't be trusted with housing, Minister. You just can't be trusted. I think Jean Kerrigan has said we shouldn't leave housing up to developers, and we certainly shouldn't. And isn't the time now has finally come to get the Land Development Agency or some other national housing executive into action with our local authorities and to start building out and to start having 35,000, 40,000 homes being produced year in, year out, the kind of production that we need. I asked your colleague, by the way, Deputy Murphy, when would we have equilibrium in the housing market? He couldn't tell me. Will it be 2030, 2040? It will be if you stay in power.
I'm not quite sure what the question is there, but Deputy, we've taken in a very short period of time the delivery of new homes in Ireland from about 12,000 to well over 20,000 this year, in the space of 3 years. And we need to get to a figure of certainly over 30,000, in my view, per year, given the population growth in Ireland that we're seeing and is predicted. And to do that, we need to build a lot of social houses. And we're doing that, and we'll add over 10,000 to the social housing stock this year. I suspect it'll be about 12,000 next year. And that needs to continue. But we also need to ensure that we have a building sector which is deliberately delivering affordable homes and private homes for people to buy all over the country. That means working with builders. It means understanding the market and trying to make sure that we make the appropriate policy decisions to make that happen. If people are sitting on land and hoarding, we're now effectively fining them with a vacant site levy, which increases year after year. And we are doing as much as we can within the legal parameters that we can do it. And deputies should understand that if they were part of the debate on this issue when we introduced it from a legislative perspective. So we are doing a lot on infrastructure in terms of putting public funding in place through the LIHAF scheme, which I hope people understand, which is making sites work and getting houses built.
Thank you, Tom.
We are doing things on finance, we're doing things on capacity, and we have done a lot on planning. But this doesn't happen overnight. And we are seeing a dramatic increase in house building and in planning applications and in commencements.
Thank you,
and you will see the Rebuilding Ireland plan come to fruition.
Deputy Danny Healy-Rae.